Hi, welcome to Conversations. I'm Bill Kristol. Very pleased to be joined for the fourth time by Eric Edelman, a longtime veteran of the State Department, Foreign Service officer who ascended to be ambassador to several countries, actually, and then was offered and took a very senior job in the Defense Department, Undersecretary for Policy. So very rare, actually, to have have been at the most senior levels of both our major foreign policy agencies. Now a denizen of many think tanks, including CSBA, very prestigious defense think tank, who's I can't remember what those initials stand for. Actually, what is
Center for
CSBA?
Strategic and Budgetary Assessments.
Sounds very think tanky, right?
Yes.
Anyway, it's great to have you with me again, Eric. We discussed in 2017 your career to some degree, especially your adventures as ambassador to Turkey, and subsequent your what you did in the Bush administration as Undersecretary of Defense for Bob Gates. In 2018, 2019, we discussed the state of American foreign policy under President Trump and some of the threats and dangers. But I thought this will be a great time to have now at the end of, what is it, November 30th, 2020, a forward-looking discussion on, we have a new administration. You've been through these transitions before. You've worked for both Democratic and Republican administrations, obviously. So maybe what we see ahead, what advice we would give them, challenges, opportunities, and so forth. Does that make sense?
Sounds good, Bill. It's great to be with you again.
It's good. It's good to have you back. You're always a source of enlightenment and calm and good sense on foreign policy, but also suitable alarm sometimes. So again, an unusual combination. Um, so it's actually November 30th. It occurs to me this is Winston Churchill's birthday. I should point out. I think we're both Churchill fans. So I don't know what hat tip we can give Churchill here, except that sometimes things get better after they look very dark, right? That'll be one lesson of his career. But what do we think? Okay, so it's the Biden comes in January 20th. They ask you, okay, enough of all this big think, Eric. We're all understand the critique of Trump and the importance of restoring American global leadership, but let's be concrete because we can talk about that till we're blue in the face. What if Jake Sullivan or Tony Blinken, people you've known a long time, call you up, or President Biden, whom you've known a long time, calls you up? What do you tell them? Both sort of big focus, and then we'll get to some particular challenges, perhaps.
Well, first, let me just say, Bill, that having been through five transitions myself between administrations of different parties, but also of the same party, this is probably obviously the most challenging and difficult transition that I've ever seen. I mean, the Reagan to Bush transition, ironically, was perhaps as challenging in a different kind of way.
Right.
But this is going to be a very, challenging transition. And the Biden team, I think, before I even give them any advice, have already done one thing that I think is really important, and something that when I was a part of the Romney transition, we thought about a lot as we approached the prospect of taking over the government. Obviously, we never did, which is to pick a team of people who can actually work together. We don't have the full national security team named yet, because of course they're still awaiting a designation of a Secretary of Defense designate. But the team that's been announced so far are a very accomplished group of people who know each other well, have good ties to the president-elect, and I think will function very effectively as a team. And that's no small thing, given the challenges that they're going to face. They're going to face one of the most complex national security environments that any administration, is had to face coming into office. I don't think I have to give them much advice about their first priority, which is clearly going to be, as President Trump might say, COVID, COVID, COVID. They are going to be very focused on, in the first instance, getting a handle on the pandemic, and then restarting the economy. Because in national security affairs, unless you have those two problems, beginning to be solved, you really lack the sinews of power to do very much on the international stage. But if I was going to give them one piece of advice, it would be to avoid what I've seen in all these previous transitions, which is the tendency of the incoming team to abominate all the works of the previous administration and to try to undo them. It's almost universally the case that the new team comes in and wants to understandably set its own course, and therefore there's a predisposition to overturn everything that's been done by the predecessor. In this instance, there are some things that need to be overturned for sure, but not everything, and including on the COVID front. I mean, I think the administration is likely to want to return to the WHO, which probably is advisable, but holding the WHO accountable for the fact that it allowed itself to be, to some degree, misled by the People's Republic of China about the COVID pandemic is going to be very, very important. And so not everything, I mean, walking out of the WHO was probably a mistake, but demanding accountability wasn't. And so going back in, I would urge them to do that.
I mean, I would say that it's striking that you say this, since you were such a critic, as I was, of President Trump and supported President-elect Biden. But it's striking, therefore, for you to say it's not maybe quite what people would have expected, to say that they shouldn't simply overturn everything, which I think is interesting. And I don't know how much pressure they'll be under to just do the opposite of everything Trump did, but give another instance or two of the way in which they can build on Trump or make some course corrections without simply reversing. And where do you think they should just simply sort of say, no, that was then, and we're going in a different direction?
Well, I think for sure, in terms of how we treat our allies and our alliances, which are one of the principal instruments of our national power in international affairs, it makes all sense in the world to take a very, different attitude towards our NATO allies, to our bilateral treaty allies in East Asia, and to those countries in the Middle East with whom we don't have any formal treaty relationships, but have longstanding partnerships of various kinds, or special relationships, like with Israel and Egypt and some of the Gulf countries. So I think that is an area where a course correction or reversal makes sense. I think they want to get a good sense of where things stand today in a couple of areas that'll come at them pretty quickly. One will be the New START treaty, which expires in February, and therefore will require them to make.
So that's a bilateral treaty with Russia.
It's a treaty with Russia that regulates strategic nuclear weapons. It expires after 10 years, negotiated in early Obama administration. There will be some pressure to just extend the treaty. And I think they ought to take a look at what the Trump administration tried to do. The Trump administration, in my view, waited too long to deal with this issue. But when it finally started to try and deal with it, they raised real questions that need to be addressed, which include the issues of making sure that all Russian nuclear weapons, including their very large stockpile of non-strategic weapons, so-called tactical nuclear weapons. I prefer the term theater because they're not tactical in any real sense, but the making sure that the new exotic weapons that Russia has unveiled over the last few years are counted under the treaty, but also that China, which has embarked on its own quantitative and qualitative modernization of its nuclear forces, somehow gets roped into this process, of arms control as well. And that's going to be a tricky thing. It can't be done immediately, but it's an important thing to try and get at. So I would urge them not to just roll the treaty over, but rather to, because the Russians are quite anxious to extend the treaty, use the leverage to build on some of what the Trump administration was trying to move to, and just get a series of 1-year rollovers that would be dependent on how serious the administration believes the Russians are negotiating the future on these other issues that have to be attended to.
So on that, you would put off in a way the big decisions, but not give Russia what it wants right away, and presumably begin those negotiations. I hadn't really realized. I mean, I don't think most lists of the big challenges they face don't necessarily include that, as people so much put nuclear weapons out of their mind these days, I suppose, and there's so many other issues with Putin to deal with. But I mean, say a word, since you've mentioned Russia, about Russia, and then about China, which will obviously be two big challenges. They'll have to decide, at least in terms of tone, how they deal with that right from the beginning.
Well, of course, I mean, Democrats after the 2016 election kind of rediscovered their, inner Cold Warrior, and have been very critical, rightly, of President Putin's Russia, and particularly its interference in U.S. and other elections. So I think there's already a predisposition there to be tough. Arms control is actually the one area where there might be an exception, because it's been prioritized so often in the past by Democratic administrations. And I think, again, it needs to be taken as a important part, but only one part of a broader agenda with Russia. And it's one reason why I say, well, it probably should be rolled over rather than have the treaty go away and have to start from scratch. And there's some reasons why that would not be ideal. But I think it's important not to just roll it over for 5 years, but rather to try and use some leverage to get the Russians to address issues of concern, to the United States. On China, I think actually there is sort of pretty broad bipartisan consensus that China represents a enormous challenge for the United States, probably the most serious long-term strategic challenge that the United States faces, and that we have re-entered an era of great power competition, and that we have to think about China in terms of that competition. I think there'll be efforts on the part of the Biden folks. I mean, there's already indications in articles that have been written by members of this team that have been announced, and other people likely to populate the administration, that they're looking at it that way. They, I think, want to avoid creating a confrontation with China, which makes sense. But the challenge for them will be, how to balance being very tough on China on both the economic questions of China's predatory economic statecraft, as well as some of the other national security issues we face with China in the Indo-Pacific region. How to balance being tough with not getting to a point of confrontation with China. The other issue that I think will force itself on them relatively early will be the question of the Iran nuclear deal, because Iran is going through its own presidential elections in June, and there will be many people who will say we have to help the Iranian moderates in the election by trying to interfere benignly by negotiating or returning to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal that the Obama administration agreed to in 2015. I think the danger there is that this pursues a long-standing tendency of the United States to try and influence Iran's internal politics in ways that don't tend to work out very well. And this is what my former boss, Bob Gates, used to call the elusive search for Iranian moderates. I understand the temptation, but I think it's something that has to be avoided. I mean, every administration comes in, particularly after being out of power for 4 or 8 years. It takes them a little bit of time to discover what's changed, how the world has changed. Biden recognizes this himself, by the way. He's said that this is going to be a Biden administration, not a third Obama administration. He's acknowledged that a lot has changed in the world. On Iran, a lot has changed, which is going to make it hard for him to make good on his promise to just go back into the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, first is that the Iranians are massively out of compliance with the limits set by the JCPOA. But moreover, Iranian behavior in the region has not changed in the way that President Obama hoped it would. He hoped it would lead to a sort of modus vivendi between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran. Far from it. It's led to more aggressive Iranian behavior in the Gulf, but also throughout the region. And the Iranian ballistic missile program, which was left untouched by the agreement, has moved ahead. And many of the deadlines that were set in 2015 that seemed like they were very far away, 15, 10, 8, 5-year deadlines, are now coming up, and are much closer to the horizon. One of them expired during the presidential campaign on October 18th, which was the conventional arms embargo on Iran. And, Russia, China already talking about providing Iran with new conventional weapons because the Trump administration was unable to get the Security Council to extend the embargo. So a lot has changed, and it will be very difficult, I think, to just walk back into the deal. Moreover, the Trump administration, because of its maximum pressure campaign against Iran, has really kind of beggared the Iranian economy. And Iran is desperate to get out from under these sanctions, which means the new administration has a lot of leverage if it chooses to try and apply it. And I think they will probably pay some price politically if they don't, because it will, one, pick a fight with Republicans in the Senate, but not just Republicans, because there were many Democratic members of the United States Senate who were opposed to the deal. They didn't get to vote against it because it was never submitted for a vote. But those who came out against it include the minority leader, Senator Chuck Schumer, the ranking Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez, and also the next ranking Democrat, Senator Ben Cardin from Maryland. So there will be bipartisan skepticism about just walking back into this deal, despite people's criticisms of the Trump administration for the unilateral manner in which it walked out of the deal. So there, I think, again, it would be wise to take some time, take the measure of the circumstance, and try to gain what leverage you can from what your predecessors did, however much you dislike some of what they did.
I mean, I'm struck by this. I mean, we're talking about what they should do, maybe more than what you think they will do. But so I'm curious what you think they will do. And you seem to be putting a fair amount of weight, which I'm sympathetic to, but not all of our friends maybe agree with, on the notion that a first Biden term won't be simply a third Obama term, that a lot of these people, of course, almost all of them served, beginning with the former Vice President Biden in the Obama administration, but that they were either they see that circumstances have changed, or they've been mugged by reality a little bit, or they've just, maybe they didn't always get their way in the first Obama administration, but for whatever reasons, it's not going to be back to the Obama 2009 Cairo speech, or the John Kerry negotiating the Iran deal, or the reset with Russia, or the combination, I think one could say fairly, or hope for accommodation with China. I mean, all those things you seem to be saying that it would be a mistake to automatically assume that they're going to that this administration will look like the Obama administration.
I mean, look, it remains to be determined, how they're going to actually respond to certain things. But, yes, I do think several of them feel like they've been mugged by reality. I think there's a recognition, for instance, that while they may have been critical coming into office of what they regarded as the Bush administration's overreaction in Iraq and the Operation Iraqi Freedom, that there was perhaps an underreaction to what was going on in Syria. I think there's also a recognition that after, in fact, contributing to the NATO operation in Libya, that there was a failure to stabilize the situation afterwards. There was a kind of unwillingness to engage in the kind of stabilization efforts that might have been required, and that has left the field open to others, and that others filling the void left by failure to exert U.S. leadership allows Russia, Iran, Turkey, the Gulf states to involve themselves in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, and even further afield, and that has not had benign consequences necessarily, that didn't make the situation better. In most cases, it made the situation worse. Even when it's your friends who are, interceding in something because you're not, it's not necessarily the case that they're going to do what you think is wise or appropriate and not create more problems than might have been caused had you been more engaged yourself. And I think there's a recognition of that. Now, how they will actually respond to, specific events, we'll have to see. And I'll be quite happy to criticize them if I think they're underreacting or overreacting, whatever the case may be. But I'd like to give them a chance to actually do things before people start, sending mean tweets their way.
What about Afghanistan and Iraq, where President Trump has announced a drawdown of troops that leaves some people think so few that it's almost very hard to even see how that they can do the job they're supposed to be doing in terms of just basic counterterrorism and helping the government? Do you think the Biden administration and will take the attitude of those were problems of the past, and I guess we'll just finish getting out and then deal with the world as it is after? Or will they see that or judge that that's a mistake and try to sort of keep some forces there, maybe even reverse Trump a little bit there? That seems to be a big sort of a dilemma given where the Democratic Party has been and where Biden himself has been on some of these issues.
I agree. I think so. There's a great hunger, to end these endless wars, as President Trump has said, and as there a number of people on the left wing of the Democratic Party have said, Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, others. I think the folks in the Biden administration may find themselves a bit trapped here because, as you say, the president seems to be driving the numbers down to the point where it's hard to see how some of these forces can do much more than engage in force protection for themselves. And it might just be that that the Biden folks just say, look, this isn't worth the candle. Let's just pull out. As the Wall Street Journal pointed out in an editorial last week, the politics of this may turn out to be very bad for President Trump and his those in the Republican Party who've enabled this kind of irresponsible drawdown at the last minute. And that's because I think people do recognize that, if the Taliban overthrow the regime in Afghanistan, and if Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State reestablish a foothold there, or if the same were to happen in Iraq, where we saw what happened when U.S. forces withdrew at the end of 2011, and Syria was left untended. By 2014, we had a Islamic State caliphate, through part of Syria and Iraq, which then took the better part of 3 years to eliminate militarily. That if those things were to recur and those places become, a petri dish for terrorism, as it were, and the source of plotting and God forbid, not just plotting, but attacks, mass casualty attacks against the United States, like the one that befell us on 9/11, or against our allies, there will be a political penalty to be paid. However much the public says today it wants to end these endless wars, if it's done in an irresponsible way and it leads to attacks against the homeland or U.S. allies, I think there will be a political price to pay. And if you're the Biden administration, you might say, you know what, this was something Trump did. We really had no choice because they drove the numbers so low. So they own it. And that will be a political logic, frankly, be hard to argue with, I think.
I mean, do you think that there's general public, well, I guess both public support and elite support, let me put it this way, for the kind of foreign policy you're outlining, which I would say is a centrist, traditional U.S. leadership, U.S. engagement foreign policy? I mean, how much pressure will they? It's nice to talk about it here, but I mean, they're focused on the pandemic, as you yourself said you would recommend that they do. They're trying to get the economy going again. I mean, will there be a moment where Jake Sullivan or Tony Blinken will say, look, from a foreign policy point of view, Mr. President, maybe you should make this commitment here, or spend some time worrying about this negotiation there. And everyone else in the White House is going to say, oh, come on, we've got to get this pandemic put to bed and we've got to get the economy going, and the public isn't interested in this, and let's just not do much for now. I mean, how worried are you about that? Or maybe that's not doing much is okay for a while. I don't know. Yeah,
I mean, I think it's a legitimate worry, but I think though that the requirement of COVID is going to be so overwhelming that it's probably going to diminish the amount of time the president can devote to national security affairs, except for the things that really press, where there's a time deadline or there's a commitment that they feel they really have to deliver on because so much support in the party for it or in the public. I think they're going to be able to keep that within bounds. But presidents in general, as you know well, Bill, tend to gravitate towards national security, because it's an area where their scope for action is much greater than it is on the domestic front, because of particularly in divided government. If we end up after January 5th with Republicans continuing to hold the Senate, the domestic constraints on presidential freedom of action and domestic policy are just so much greater. And in this case, you also have a former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who has a fair amount of interest in national security, has a lot of background, knows a lot of world leaders. So it'll be, very natural to gravitate towards that. But I think they are very, very focused, from what I can tell, appropriately on getting both COVID under control and then the economy restarted. And I think they do recognize that until they do those things, it's going to be very hard to exert a great deal of influence, in the international arena.
What about other challenges? Something always happens, right? We were busy managing 24/7 the end of the Cold War in 1990, and then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and suddenly we had a 6-8 month interregnum of fighting a rather major war in the Gulf, not on people's radar screens, I would say, a few months before that. Is there something? I mean, who knows, of course, but I mean, how much of a set of problems that they can anticipate are they likely to be able to deal with? Most of your recommendations, at least, are in a fairly methodical but not crisis-oriented way, I guess I would say. And surely they will also, I'll just interrupt myself to say, surely they will also do a lot of symbolic stuff to tell the world, as President-elect Biden has said, that we're back and we're not ignoring our allies and we care about multinational organizations and stuff. And all that stuff is sort of, I think they can do and is sort of fairly not easy to lay out, but you can figure out how to lay that out. And then suddenly something happens, and you've been in the middle of that, and there are 19 meetings in a week in the White House and the State Department and the Defense Department and so forth. Anything on your radar screen that people aren't talking about?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is, I think they're going to have to take stock of the damage that's been done institutionally to the Department of Defense, particularly the Department of State, and to the National Security Council apparatus. And I think they're going to have to do some rebuilding of institutional capacity, because the idea that after 4 years, everything just snaps back to the way it was, there's been a lot of loss of institutional muscle memory. And I think that's going to take a little bit of work on their part. Moreover, it's fine to say, the United States is back, and that does send an important message. But for a lot of our allies and friends around the world, they're going to wonder, well, what does that really mean? What does it mean when you say, we're really back? Because as you said at the outset, we've had a long period of time here, not just the 4 years of Trump, but much of the 8 years of President Obama, in which the watchword for U.S. policy was restraint or leading from behind, as opposed to the more aggressive U.S. leadership role that friends and allies had become accustomed to, including in the post-Cold War, and especially in the post-Cold War, when the United States was, arguably the world's sole remaining superpower, or it was, as Charles Krauthammer said, the unipolar moment. So it's going to be, I think, a question that people have when the United States says it's back. How much is it really willing to do? How much leadership is it willing to exert? What price is it willing to pay in order to, exercise leadership? Because there is a price to be paid. So in addition to, sort of the institutional questions, and then, kind of taking steps to reassure allies that go beyond just saying we're back, there'll be other things that are going to, impose themselves on the Biden folks. One of my favorite quotations about foreign affairs is from Harold Macmillan, former British Prime Minister, who once, when speaking at Oxford, was asked by a student what had been the animating force behind his foreign policy, and he said, "Events, dear boy, events." And once they're in office in January, there will be drinking from the proverbial fire hose of events around the world. And they'll be dealing with these, this complex security environment. I mentioned the China-Russia great power competition. We've talked about Iran. We haven't talked about North Korea yet, but that'll be another challenge. And then the jihadist ongoing threat, which we've talked about a bit, and that's before you even get to the pandemic. So they've got a lot on their plate, but there will be other things that will start to, impose themselves. One is there will be undoubtedly pressure from the Congress for them to do something to try and end the war in Yemen and the humanitarian catastrophe that's taking place there. And as we speak, there's another potential problem blowing up, which is in the Horn of Africa in Ethiopia, where the Ethiopian president, Abiy Ahmed, has launched forces against the province of Tigray. He's given them a 72-hour ultimatum, and there's fighting going on around the Tigrayan capital of the state. And you've already got 40,000 refugees. This is a country that is deeply divided on ethnic terms. It's been through a civil war that led to an independent Eritrea. It has a population of 109 million people, so it's roughly 4 or 5 times the size of Syria. And if it were to become a failed state and break down, it would send a flood of refugees that would, clearly dwarf what we've already seen. And we know how much the Syrian refugee crisis destabilized Europe, destabilized its politics, created, partially responsible for creating this wave of populist nationalism that's swept over the world, really, not just East Central Europe, but parts of the Indo-Pacific and here at home. And so that's, I think, something that will probably engage their attention relatively early on as well.
I wonder, I mean, I was thinking about this. I hadn't paid any attention, frankly, to Ethiopia. And then I saw a little bit over the weekend and thought, geez, what if there's some huge catastrophe coming and there is a sort of case for some form of multilateral intervention to at least stabilize the situation? And I thought back to the one transition I was part of, which was the exiting George H.W. Bush administration and the incoming Bill Clinton. And my memory may be tricking me, but I think we sent troops to Somalia, to
Correct.
Mogadishu,
Yes.
an ill-fated expedition, as it turned out, of course, in December, I think, of 1992.
That's
I remember
correct.
it was all, I mean, I wasn't involved at all in these decisions. And my main memory is calling, as I do think I remember calling Vice President Gore's incoming chief of staff to give him a heads up that the president had decided to do this, and that obviously his boss would be getting a phone call from Brent Scowcroft or someone to explain it. And we weren't asking for, they could just say it was our decision and not have to have an opinion about it, but we wanted them to be able to start thinking hard about what they were going to do. And we did cooperate with them. And I think it had bipartisan support at the time. It ended up badly months later, obviously. But actually, in a way, then that is a good case study of how something no one was focused on led to, which then we had the disaster in Mogadishu. We got out of that. I think that really, don't you think, made the Clinton administration averse to intervening in other places, which then had its own knock-on effects in Rwanda and, of course, in the Balkans, actually, where they were slow to intervene. And so I guess it's a good example of how something that people haven't paid much attention to at all can have all kinds of unanticipated effects and become quite important in the overall foreign policy of an administration.
I know, absolutely. It's one example of many, and it's one reason why I and so many others on the national security community were worried about the delay of the start of the transition, because a transition for our system is very complex and very complicated. We're a presidential system, not a parliamentary democracy. I mean, in the United Kingdom, the outgoing prime minister, the day after the election, walks out of number 10, and the incoming prime minister walks in, and he or she is handed a big red box by the permanent cabinet undersecretary full of memos and documents from the Foreign Office and the Defense Ministry and what have you. And life just ticks on, and the permanent undersecretaries and all the ministries in London, down in Whitehall, just keep doing their job. We have a much more complex system that requires an enormous effort to staff up the government in a very short period of time. And I remember during the transition from Clinton to Bush 43, it got started very late because of the disputed election in Florida. I think it was 36 days late, if memory serves. And I remember I came back from overseas in like early February. So it was literally about a week to 10 days after the new administration had been sworn in. But I honestly could feel a little bit the sense of the rush transition, because as one of my foreign service mentors once said to me, transition time is equal to 3 times governing time, because it's a period when you have the relative luxury of not being pressed by events to think about how you might plan or handle different issues. And while the plan, never survives first contact with the enemy, the plan always has to change. It at least gives you a starting point from which to tackle a problem, and you've at least thought about how to think about it. And that was a problem. That was a problem for the Bush 43 administration. They'd been denied a lot of that time to think about these problems while they were focused elsewhere.
I mean, give me your sense of assuming the Biden administration tries to do 75% of what you would like, and kind of a fairly responsible, engaged foreign policy, including making some tough choices and asking the American public to not catering to a excessive isolationism or come home America, or what, can't we just wash our hands of all of this? Well, I guess how easy do you think that'll be in general? As a student of American politics and history, is the public there for a kind of reasonably engaged foreign policy? Let's leave aside the Democrats, which I'm not sure you or I have much more judgment on than anyone else, but you've spent a lot of time in the last decade with Republicans, not so much the Trump administration, though actually you've talked to a ton of people who were in the Trump administration, who were on the less political, less Trumpy side of it, but certainly with congressional Republicans. You probably have been in the top few of people who briefed them, met with them, counseled them. Where do you think the Republican Party in Congress would be, and then maybe also the American public, if Biden, doesn't pull out of everywhere, says, what, we may have to help out with a multinational force in Ethiopia, and incidentally, on some of these issues, I'm going to postpone Russia start for a year, but not simply abrogate it, but not simply extend it. I mean, would he have a party that's somewhat willing, and the Republican Party, to give him some leeway and give him some support? Or is it all going to be sort of just attacks from the right and attacks from the left? In which case I could imagine the kinds of things you and I would like being under pretty heavy assault, and maybe, the Biden administration not having the ability or the will to kind of push through with a lot of these things.
I think you've put your finger, frankly, on the biggest challenge, Bill, that they're going to face, because I do think they're going to be attacked from both left and right on many of these policies. I think one of the biggest challenges they're going to have is a combination of, the maintaining this. I talked about the sinews of power, and I was talking about getting the economy back. But the other element of the sinews of power, of course, is your military strength, and not necessarily because you want to be profligate about using it, but because, as George Kennan once said in a lecture he gave to the National War College in 1946, you have no idea how much more collegial and constructive diplomacy is if you have a little bit of quiet military force in the background. The defense budget's already slated to decline slightly under President Trump. And although President Trump has claimed that he's completely rebuilt the military, people like the people who are being considered by President-elect Biden to be Secretary of Defense know that that's not true, that he has increased the budget over a period of 3 years, and that's helped buy back some of the deficits in readiness that resulted from the cuts that came out of the Budget Control Act and the various bipartisan budget deals over the last decade. But it has not by any means bought off the problem that we will have. They're going to have trouble, I think, with that, because there are going to be elements in both their party and in the House Republican Conference who are going to see the defense budget account as just one more budget account to be cut. On the one hand, because people want to on the left, free up money for domestic discretionary spending, and on the right because they just want to cut the government. And that's going to be a challenge. And the other challenge I think they're going to have is that their instinct for multilateralism, which in the wake of this administration is not necessarily a bad thing, may come at the expense of recognizing one key part for me of multilateralism, and it may be the biggest single thing that differentiates kind of conservative internationalists from liberal internationalists, which is sometimes, not always, but sometimes, multilateralism can only work if there is a concern among your allies and partners that unless they join you, you're going to go it alone. I mean, we find that with our partners, and there's no reason why it doesn't apply the other way. And I think their biggest temptation is going to be to just be multilateral all the time without necessarily having that kind of harder edge to it. And I worry that Republicans are going to just go into opposition mode. And you can see that from some of the tweets that have come from members of the Senate about the new team, even before they've done anything. I remember briefing Speaker Boehner. It was actually then Minority Leader Boehner back in 2009 with a couple of other former senior folks about the Obama Afghanistan surge. And Boehner was really anxious to do the right thing, to do the responsible thing. But there were people in that room, some of whom thankfully are no longer in the Congress, but whose views, unfortunately, are still perhaps strong in the conference, who basically were taking the position that, well, this is Obama's war now. We don't really care how it goes. In fact, the worse it goes, the better, which was, I thought something only Leninists said, and had no regard for the overall national interest. So I do worry that you're going to see that kind of oppositionism. I do think that the Senate Majority Leader wants to be constructive and wants to work with the Biden administration. He has if you think back to all the various budget deals that were done in the Obama administration, it was usually Biden and McConnell who were, down at the bottom of the scrum, making these things happen. And I think he wants to be constructive, but I think there's going to be a pull, particularly among those members of the Senate and perhaps some outside who want to run in what John Bolton calls the Trump lane of the Republican Party, to just be, opposed, as opposed to being a constructive, loyal opposition.
Yeah, I think that's a big question. And then, of course, Trump will be there, and Trumpists on the outside will be there, and that'll put pressure on others to be more America first, let's say, and to find every time that they do something that even you and I might view as too multilateral, too accommodating to random allies and so forth, they'll view that as just a terrible sellout of American sovereignty. And then, anything. But on the other hand, if Biden does send 2,000 troops back to Afghanistan or something, I'm just making this up, but they'll also attack that. So it could be. And then on the left of his own party and even the center of his own party, how much support does Biden get for these things? It's a tricky position there, and I guess it's not unprecedented. Is it unprecedented in American politics really to be kind of so, I don't know, taking over in a tough position like this with attacks from both wings? I don't know. Is there a good analogy for that? I can't really.
Well, when you think about it, Harry Truman faced something similar, right, in the early years of the Cold War. And he ended up, having, both the segregationist, wing of his party walk out and the, progressive left wing of his party walk out. And when he tried to, take the United States, when he successfully took the United States into NATO, he did have bipartisan support, but he also had opposition from both the progressive left and the isolationist Republican right. So, it's not totally without precedent, but it's awkward and difficult and going to be tricky for them to navigate.
Yeah, I guess Truman had, it's funny when you think about it, he had the Henry Wallace left, which we now tend to regard as a little bit of he was a flake, Henry Wallace stuff, but it was a powerful part of the Democratic Party. He had been vice president after all under Roosevelt. And then the Joe McCarthy right, a little later chronologically, but in spirit, and even the Robert Taft, right, which was not dishonorable the way McCarthy was, but was not
Correct.
on
Right.
board the U.S. Being the cornerstone of an international liberal order. So, and Truman did navigate that, but not without a lot of difficulty, and not without ending up in Korea, and not without leaving after a term and a half, I guess you'd say, but and so forth. So it
Oh, it was
is,
very challenging.
yeah.
I mean, it came out well. It worked out in the end well. So, as always, we tend to look back on it and think, oh, well, it was all, couldn't have been that hard because it all came out okay. But, no, it was, it might not have worked out that way. And, essentially, when you think about it, the sort of Henry Wallace progressive left, I mean, I always like to remind people that George McGovern, who was the 1972 nominee of the Democratic Party, was actually a delegate at the Progressive Party convention that nominated Henry Wallace in 1948. And then Taft, of course, was not the nominee again in 48, but came close to being the nominee in 52. So those two strands of opposition to U.S. global leadership were kind of repressed for a very long time, and they popped up from time to time, to be sure, in the form of the Bricker Amendment in the 1950s and McGovern, as I said, in 72. But to a large degree, there was a bipartisan consensus on these things that was ultimately shattered in the 70s under the impact of Vietnam. But it did last for quite a while, and did provide a very good basis for the United States in the Cold War.
How much and Truman and Atchison spent a lot of time thinking about how to create, I guess, public support for such a view, which didn't happen automatically, obviously. I guess Biden will have to spend some time thinking about that, even though, as you say, he'll be very focused on the economy and the pandemic to start with.
Yeah, it does. It is a function of presidential leadership. I mean, presidents have always had to, have had to explain to the American public why it's in their interest to be involved in affairs overseas. I mean, we had for many years what one of my teachers in graduate school called free security. It was never really free, but the United States was separated from the rest of the world by two very large oceans, and for much of its history, it made it very difficult to convince Americans that they really should care about what was going on in other parts of the world. And it still has a very powerful, influence on the American public today. When Truman was going to give the Truman Doctrine speech, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who had been an isolationist before the war, was the Republican Senate leader at the time, told Truman, Mr. President, if you want to really get this through the Congress, you're going to have to scare the hell out of the American people. And Atchison told him, you're going to have to make this clearer than truth. So, I mean, there is a role for, presidential leadership. The president did make a very powerful address to the Congress that did get the Truman aid through. George Marshall made a very powerful address at Harvard a year later to justify the expenditures of the Marshall Plan that provided the liquidity that allowed Europe to rebuild. These are things that are going to have to be, pursued by a Biden administration if they're going to be successful. I think there is a strong residue of support for alliances, for free trade in polling data, and it can be tapped. But it will need to be tapped. I think actually one of President Obama's great failures as a leader was his unwillingness to rally the public for any particular international purpose, and rather, saw his role as to, not do stupid stuff, as he said.
Yeah, no, that strikes me as a very important question. I mean, raises a very important question that Truman did have the benefit. I mean, everyone was exhausted after World War II, understandably, and so everyone wanted to come home, and he had to reverse that in 47, 48. But he did have the benefit of the pre-war experience and the lessons that could be taken from American isolationism in the 20s and 30s, and then the benefit of winning the war, obviously, and therefore it was maybe easier to get Americans to step up to a certain role after that. I mean, now Biden is coming off, you could argue, I mean, what, don't you think 12 years of presidents who didn't aggressively make the case for U.S. global leadership and in different ways criticized it. I mean, Trump very explicitly, America first, it was all a horrible mistake, all the wars, Iraq, Afghanistan. Obama, maybe a little more complicated, but still the spirit of the Cairo speech and so forth, certainly this has been a terrible mistake, this certainly Iraq, but even the whole concept in a way of I mean, I think when people look back, they might say there was the Clinton and Bush administrations were kind of more similar than different. Indispensable nation. We've got to step up to these challenges, differences in some particular choices like Iraq, though, of course, that had the support from most of the Clinton administration veterans, including Hillary Clinton, including Joe Biden, for that matter. But and then with Obama and Trump, I guess the question is sort of after 12 years of being told by presidents of both parties that nation building begins at home, and a lot of these traditional commitments are either overdone. In the case of Obama, probably didn't really try to pull troops out of Germany or Korea much, but or in the case of Trump, really attacked these commitments as foolish. And I mean, it's just a question, I guess, how much support is there, how easy it is to rebuild, how much Obamaism on the one hand and Trumpism on the other. And I don't say that to make them exactly at all analogous, but they're both things penetrated both parties. I mean, I guess that's a big. Do you have a sense of that, or what? I mean,
it's an excellent point, an excellent question. I mean, so if you go back and look at President Obama's interviews with Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic, you do see early, indicators, of or precursors of Trumpism. I mean, again, I'm not trying to make a moral equivalence here. There's a difference in the intellectual level of the argument as well as the way in which it was couched. But President Obama very much thought our allies were deadbeats who weren't pulling their weight, and he said as much to Jeffrey Goldberg. He was very skeptical about the free trade agreements that he inherited in various forms of negotiation from the Bush 43 administration. And although he ultimately negotiated the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, we shouldn't forget that by the time he did it, it was an election year, which is a pretty bad year to do any trade agreement for a variety of political reasons we don't have to spend a lot of time on. And by that point, the two leading contenders to succeed him in the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, had both come out against it. And I think that's going to be one indication of the kind of challenge that the Biden administration faces, inheriting all this, because are they going to remove the tariffs that Trump has slapped on China? I'm not sure they will, not right away anyhow, because there's a lot of support in the Democratic Party from trade unions and human rights advocates for precisely that kind of approach to China. So I think when we talk about what could be a mobilizer for bipartisanship, I do think the competition with China is perhaps the area where there is some scope for it if the Biden folks are really smart and creative, which I think they're certainly smart. Well, whether they're creative or not, we'll find out. But we might finally get infrastructure week, in a Biden administration, because I can see putting together, a plan for, investment in infrastructure, particularly infrastructure for telecommunications and things like that, framed in the context of the strategic competition with China and dealing with China's civil military fusion and its predatory economic statecraft, that could win some support from Republicans if they're not just, into bloody-minded opposition.
Do we have to go back to some version of the TPP, though, to knit back together the alliance that was supposed to constrain China? I mean, now China's made their own deal. It looks like I haven't really followed it closely with all these Asian countries. So how much behind the eight ball are we in trying to do what we could have done 5 years ago?
Well, yeah, I think we are behind the eight ball. We would have been behind the eight ball, frankly, even if Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016, because she had come out against the TPP, and that was going to be a problem for her to unwind that commitment, even though I think almost all of her advisors, thought it was ill-considered. Walking back from that kind of campaign promise is tough for anybody. So yes, I think that's trade policy. I think is going to be one of the more challenging things that the Biden administration will inherit. I do think they have one opportunity, which is to sort of get rid of the various trade impediments that Trump has thrown in the way of the transatlantic relationship. I think there are already signs that the Europeans, who've been a little bit slow to get the China challenge, have now begun to get it, and I think they understand that a transatlantic partnership to deal with China is probably important. I think there's a big opportunity for the Biden administration there to try and come up with a transatlantic understanding on how to deal with China, which is what Trump would have done to deal with China had he been smart about it, just based on the sort of law of conservation of enemies, which is a basic diplomatic axiom. He could have. You don't declare a trade war on the whole world. That doesn't work.
Yeah, it didn't work too well. It sounds to me though that I think this has been an interesting conversation for me because you're both very worried, I would say, about the next 10, 20, 30 years. And it's a huge challenge for American statecraft, I think you think, in terms of, and both because the world is really a challenge, because we've disadvantaged ourselves over the last few years, and maybe the last 10, 12 years, maybe the last 30 in certain ways, not doing some things. On the other hand, I'd say, since you and I were both anti-Trump, I think I can say this. I feel like you're a little less alarmed about the short term than we might have expected a year or two or three ago. Have the institutions in a funny way, or the international order, survived the kind of assault, both rhetorical and symbolic, but also real in some cases, of Trump and the Trump administration better than you expected? I mean, it's.
I think it's a little bit hard to say. I think it's we'll know. I mean, when maybe 6 months or a year from now, when we see how well the Biden folks have been able to navigate this sort of obstacle course that you and I have been describing today. If they're able to kind of resuscitate the institutions here, first of all, in the United States, strengthen NATO's sense of cohesion against Russia, which is very much at risk, in part because of some of the challenges of populist nationalism that resident inside both the EU and NATO now. If they're able to figure out how to work with our partners in the Indo-Pacific, absent a TPP, then I think we'll be able to say, well, yes, kind of we dodged a bullet there. But I think it's hard to know how much damage has been done and how reparable it is until you see people try to repair it and see how successful they are.
Yeah, no, it is hard to judge, isn't it? Anything you would look for? I mean, sort of 3, 6, 9, 12 months in to kind of say, what, I think things are going to be okay, or is it just too many moving parts to almost focus on one or two? And I guess some things will go better than other things, right? I mean,
every first year of every administration is a bit of a shakedown cruise, and it's too early, I think, to judge administration, because you can have a fairly kind of disastrous, first year, as the Clinton administration did, and then come back and still have some real achievements, as they did, I think, with NATO enlargement and with, with the WTO and some others, NAFTA. So, I mean, it takes, it'll take a little bit of time to see how their team is performing, to see whether, as I said, it's not a team of rivals, it's a team of colleagues, which is, I think, by and large, a good thing. See how well they work together, how well they're able to overcome some of the problems here at home, both the institutional damage that's been done and then the bipartisanship that we were talking about, whether that can be resuscitated or whether they end up just having a very obstreperous Congress. I mean, they don't have much room for maneuver because even if they win 2 seats in Georgia on January 5th, which is a big if, you know, it would be a 51-50 Senate where the vice president of the United States would be sitting in the chair almost the entire time because she would have to cast the deciding vote. And the House margin is going to be what, 6-7 seats?
Very small.
Very short, very small. So it's going to be a real challenge, I think, you know, to navigate that.
Yeah, it strikes me how on the one hand, you know, as you say, administrations often have rocky first years. On the other hand, this is not, it's from everything we've been saying, it seems like they actually they can't afford, but it will be a pretty big price to be paid for too rocky a first year. And I do think don't you think around the world, people are looking and they sort of don't know what to make of the Trump experience. Was that kind of a weird 4-year parenthesis? But now the US is back, assuming in a suitably updated way, presumably its traditional role, or is Trump a little bit of a, you know, precursor, a harbinger of the future, and Biden is in a way the parenthesis? And I do think that decision could be made by people, leaders around the world in Europe and Asia fairly quickly. I mean, they may not wait all 4 years, is what I'm saying, to make it. So there's probably more pressure on Biden than there has typically been to sort of get things right, or as right as you can get them in foreign policy, which is mostly right, pretty quickly.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think you will see that if you talk to, you know, Europeans, many of them don't see this as having been a 4-year, you know, aberration. They see basically 12 years of U.S. reticence to lead. And, you know, they're trying to figure out, is this 12 years like over and exceptional? Is this just a phase? Or is this really the, you know, the new dispensation? And there'll probably be no place where this is a bigger challenge for the Biden administration in the Middle East, because, you know, in the Middle East, the sense that this was not just a lingering problem, but a more prolonged, you know, retrograde of U.S. power out of the region has led people to do a lot of things on their own. It's led to both Iran and Turkey being much more aggressive in the region in different ways. It's led a lot of our friends to take things into their own hands. You know, our Israeli friends have been relentlessly attacking Iranian forces inside Syria with literally hundreds of airstrikes. I mean, essentially, it's self-help if the United States can't be counted on to be there. Our friends in the Gulf, I think, found the Trump administration, despite all its tough talk and its pulling out of the JCPOA, essentially unwilling to strike back. I mean, and despite the, you know, the Qasem Soleimani attack back in January, they basically concluded, you know, we can't count on the Americans to be here. You know, they're pulling troops out, they're getting out. The erratic decision making in Syria, the, you know, suggestion they were going to pull down you know, forces in Iraq and get out altogether of Afghanistan, and maybe out of Iraq altogether. I mean, what led to the you know, so-called Abraham Accords, these peace agreements between the UAE and Bahrain and Israel, was a sense that the U.S. was really retreating from the region, and that those countries who are you know, rightly concerned about Iran's you know, search for mastery in the region had to band together to, you know, to both more effectively oppose Iran, but also to potentially take the place of the United States, much less willing to use it, you know, itself, its own forces in the region. And that's going to be a very tricky one for the Biden administration to navigate, because they're going to, you know, they're not going to want to discourage that. They're going to want to encourage it. But I think they're also going to want to make it clear that, look, the United States is not just pulling up stakes here. We have important interests. We're going to continue to try and lead the region. We're going to have some forces, but, you know, probably smaller, lower footprint, lower visibility, more sustainable presence in the region. And before you go out and do anything rash, maybe you might want to check with us first, because that's, I think, going to be really one of the most tricky things for them to navigate, because that's where they're going to be facing real pressure from their left wing in the Democratic Party, that's going to want to undo all the terrible things the Bush 43 administration did. It's the original sin in the Middle East that has to be expunged, and that's going to be a challenge.
I mean, I guess we should close with maybe a word about Joe Biden, who, I mean, the president makes such a difference, and you can't always predict presidencies based on their previous tenure, the other offices they've held. I mean, obviously there are governors who become president where they didn't have foreign policy experience and they've reacted in different ways. Harry Truman, I don't know that one could have exactly predicted at all the kind of president he was going to become, in foreign policy. So I'm just, do you have an instinct about Joe Biden? You've certainly met him many times and testified before him, and he has a long history in the Senate and was chairman of foreign relations. And on the one hand I think people like your former boss, Bob Gates, thought his judgment was sometimes off and an error on different particular decisions. On the other hand, I would say, don't you think at a general level, he was kind of a believer in the old fashioned American global leadership and so forth. So I don't know, it's sort of unusual for him. It seems to be so much comes down to him, because at the end of the day, our friends Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken can advocate whatever they want and do a good job as far as it goes. But if the president isn't willing to step up at some key moments, it's hard to sustain that.
Yeah, I mean, our system in national security affairs is very, president centric. President Bush 43 famously said, I'm the decider. And President Kennedy, in an interview he gave a few months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, was asked about the role of advisors. He said, yeah, he said, well, what I've learned from this whole experience is that the advisors, give advice, but at the end of the day, it's the president who's got to make the decision and live with the consequences. The advisors get to go on and, give other advice later on, So yes, I mean, and Secretary Gates did say in his memoir that he thought, Vice President Biden had been wrong on most of the major policy judgments he'd come to during his long, time in the Senate. Look, I think he has been around for a very long time. He knows a lot of world leaders. I don't think his judgment's been spot on, most of the time in the past. But having the responsibility of power, does concentrate the mind in ways that even being vice president, I don't think does necessarily. And I've been encouraged, at least, by the fact that since the election, I think the tone he has set, both for foreign audiences and the domestic audience, has been very, very good. Some people have said it's been pitch perfect. And you can see it, by the way. I just was looking at some poll data this morning. Right now, I think he's sitting at 55% approval, and President Trump has dropped back down to about 42, which is pretty much the average of where he was for most of his time in office. And that's a pretty big gap. So I think the tone he's setting is good. The proof will be in the pudding, of course. Proof of the pudding will be in the tasting. I mean, we'll have to see, how he does, in office. I'm kind of cautiously optimistic that he will have learned some of the appropriate lessons from some of the misfires, in the Obama administration. And certainly, I think the last 4 years have shown, the importance both of presidential leadership and of working closely with our allies. And I think he will take those lessons to heart. So, we'll have to see. I'm sure there'll be lots to criticize. There always is. These are tough issues, and they're never easy to resolve. So.
Well, I think it's good to end on a cautiously optimistic note. I hope the president personally calls him in for advice, and certainly his senior advisors will be. So that's a good sign. But I mean, there are a lot of challenges and a lot of tricky things. That's what I'm struck by from this conversation. Just that it's maybe, even if it's not as dire, it's not as if on January 21st, because of Trump, he's got it. It's not Churchill taking over on May 10th or something of 1940. On the other hand, it's the number of challenges and the kind of complexity of them, and the interrelationships and the relationships to our domestic situation and the public and elite support for what you and I would probably think to be reasonable, responsible foreign policy. There are a lot of those things are very unusual. So it'll be interesting, that's for sure. And we'll have to get back together in a year and judge how he's done, I suppose, and give him some fresh advice.
We can take stock. I mean, they've got their work cut out for them, for sure.
So let's wish them well as Americans, obviously, and it really is an important moment. And I think the Truman analogy, I'll just say, is an interesting one that I hadn't thought much about. I think Biden compares himself occasionally to FDR in the sense of taking over, in a big crisis domestically, both economic and in this case, a pandemic, which is fair enough. And he's also, it's a way of appealing to the left of his party or too much of his party, because FDR is a great Democratic president and New Deal's ambitious, but on the other hand, it's vague enough that anyone can make of it kind of what they want. It's not a bad rhetorical point for Biden, but I do think in foreign policy, maybe he combines the sort of FDR domestic challenge with the Truman foreign policy challenge, which is also quite a daunting way to think of it,
Yeah, I mean, in a way, there's a way in which, the FDR comparison also, I think, stands up, Bill, which is, Truman was facing an international order where the chief threat to democracy internationally was from the left and from the communist-inspired left headquartered in Moscow, really. FDR had, to face challenges to democracy from both left and right, but the major challenge, and to go back to Churchill, who you started with in some sense because it's his birthday, he recognized that the biggest challenge to international order was from the revolutionary right. And that's why Churchill thought it was important to defeat the Axis before dealing with Stalin, and why he was willing to make common cause with Stalin in order to defeat the Axis. And today, globally, the biggest challenge to democracy comes from the populist, authoritarian, nationalist right.
You think so, even despite China being there as a huge superpower or competitor?
Yes, but China is, I mean, it's got a communist party sitting on top of a capitalist economy.
Right.
So it's state capitalism. It's a different kind of order of magnitude. It's a huge challenge and problem, but it's different than the Soviet challenge.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. Therefore, it's in a way dealing with challenges from all sides that are different kinds, that are different. And that's what strikes me too, is that normally, I think I said we'd end 10 minutes ago, but we're just gone for another minute. I mean, normally there's kind of one challenge that focuses the mind, the Soviet Union, the terrorism after 9/11 and so forth. It really is not so obvious. Biden has China as a big superpower, but then he has Putin as a very problematic and effective troublemaker. And then he's just got various hotspots around the world, in the Middle East and Iran, but other parts of the Middle East as well. And as you say, crises like Ethiopia, and then populist nationalism within NATO and the EU. It's an awful lot of things to. I mean, there's not obviously one organizing principle for it, I would say, except maybe that without the U.S. being strong and leading, all of these things get worse, which also maybe is like the 30s, incidentally. When you think about Ethiopia, Japan, and Mussolini and Spanish Civil War, and we were basically checked out of all, I'm to oversimplify a little, checked out of all of them, and it all got worse, basically.
It didn't get better from lack of U.S. involvement, that's for sure.
Yeah, so I think maybe that's an important lesson and a good note to end on. Eric Edelman, a very interesting and stimulating conversation for me, and I hope enjoyable for you.
Terrific.
And we'll do it again in a year. So thank you very much. And thank you for joining us on Conversations.